Every failure you have ever experienced was trying to tell you something. Not to punish you, not to prove that you are insufficient or undeserving or fundamentally incapable of the thing you were attempting. Not to confirm the fears you had about yourself before you started. Not to justify the people who doubted you or the voice inside you that wondered whether you were really the kind of person who could pull this off. To tell you something. Something specific, something useful, something that the success you were hoping for would never have been able to teach you with the same clarity and the same precision and the same undeniable authority. The problem is not the failure. The problem is what most people do with it. Most people do one of two things when they fail. They either collapse into it, let it become the definition of what they are capable of, let it write a story about who they are, let it grow from a single event into a permanent conclusion about the limits of their potential. Or they escape it, move away from it as quickly as possible, minimize the pain of it, refuse to examine it, replace the discomfort of sitting with what went wrong with the temporary comfort of pretending it did not matter, or that it was not really their fault, or that the next attempt will somehow be different without understanding why this one did not work. Neither of these responses turns the failure into anything. They either let it be a verdict or let it be background noise. And in both cases, the lesson, the specific, valuable, irreplaceable piece of information that the failure contained, goes unlearned. And the unlearned lesson does not disappear. It waits. It shows up in the next attempt, in the slightly different form of the same fundamental mistake, in the pattern that repeats because the pattern was never examined, in the life that stays roughly in the same position, not because the person is not working, but because the working is not informed by the understanding that failure was designed to provide. Today, I want to give you a different relationship with failure. Not a comfortable one, not the kind where failure stops hurting or stops mattering or stops feeling like a genuine loss of something that mattered to you, but a useful one, a transformative one, the kind of relationship with failure that the people who eventually succeed always seem to have, not because they fail less, because they get more from every failure they experience. Turn failures into lessons and grow. That is the whole practice. And for the next hour, I'm going to tell you exactly what that practice requires, what it produces, and how to actually do it in the real conditions of your real life. Let us start with a fundamental reframe, a shift in how you see failure that is not just semantic, but that changes the entire quality of your response to it. Failure is not the opposite of success. It is part of the path to it. This is one of those statements that sounds obvious when you read it, and that most people intellectually agree with immediately, and that has almost no effect on how they actually behave when they fail, because the intellectual agreement and the emotional reality are completely different things. Intellectually agreeing that failure is part of the process does not stop the failure from feeling like a verdict. It does not stop the shame or the disappointment or the doubt. It does not automatically convert the experience of failing into the experience of learning. What converts it is a practice, a specific, deliberate, consistently applied practice of engaging with failure in a way that extracts the information it contains rather than either collapsing into the pain of it or escaping from it. And that practice begins with a decision that is made before the failure arrives, not in the moment of the failure, when the emotional state makes deliberate choice difficult. Before, in the clear, calm, intentional space of deciding how you are going to relate to failure before you encounter it. The decision is this: every failure I experience will be treated as data, not as a verdict on who I am, not as evidence of permanent incapability, not as a sign that the goal was wrong or that I was wrong for pursuing it. as data, information about what happened and why, feedback about what was working and what was not, a specific, bounded, finite piece of information about a specific, bounded, finite attempt. Data can be examined. Data can be extracted. Data can be used to improve the next attempt in ways that make it meaningfully more likely to succeed than the one before it. Data does not define you. It informs you, and informed people make better decisions than uninformed ones, always. Make the decision now that failure is data, and then hold that decision when the failure arrives and the emotional response tries to convert it into something else. Now let me talk about what it actually means to turn a failure into a lesson, what the specific, practical process looks like, because the gap between the principle and the practice is where most people lose the benefit that failure was designed to provide. The process has 4 stages, and each stage requires something from you that the simpler response of collapsing or escaping does not require: honesty, courage, patience, and the willingness to be changed by what you find. The first stage is examination. Before the lesson can be learned, the failure must be examined, honestly, without the distorting filters of ego protection or self-criticism or the premature assignment of blame, just examined. What actually happened? Not the story about what happened, not the version that distributes responsibility in the most comfortable way. What actually happened, from the beginning to the end, in the sequence it occurred, with the honest acknowledgement of what each decision and each circumstance contributed to the outcome. This examination is harder than it sounds, because the ego has a powerful interest in controlling the narrative of failure. It wants to explain the failure in ways that preserve the self-concept, that locate the cause of the failure as much as possible in external circumstances and as little as possible in the person's own choices and capabilities. And there is sometimes genuine truth in the external factors. Circumstances do contribute. Timing does matter. The behavior of other people is sometimes genuinely the primary cause of a specific failure. Acknowledging external contributions is not just ego protection. Sometimes it's accurate. But the examination must be honest about both, about the external factors and the internal ones, about what was outside your control and what was within it, about the circumstance that contributed and the choice that contributed, because the lesson lives in the space between them, in the honest answer to the question, given what was outside my control, what could I have done differently inside my control that would have changed the outcome? That question, answered honestly, is where the lesson begins. The second stage is extraction. Once the failure has been honestly examined, the specific lesson it contains must be extracted, not the general feeling that things didn't work, the specific, actionable, this is what I need to change, understanding of what the failure revealed about what was missing or what was wrong or what needs to be different.
Extracted lessons have a specific quality. They are actionable. They point to something that can be done differently, a skill that can be developed, a plan that can be improved, an assumption that was wrong and that needs to be replaced with more accurate information, a timing decision that was off, a relationship or resource gap that needs to be addressed, a mental or emotional pattern that undermined the execution. Unextracted lessons remain as feelings, the feeling that things went badly, the feeling that something was off, the general sense of disappointment without the specific understanding of what the disappointment was teaching. Feelings do not improve the next attempt. Specific extracted lessons do. Ask the extraction questions after every failure. What specific assumption did this failure prove wrong? What specific skill was insufficient for this challenge? What specific decision made differently would have changed the outcome? What specific information did I not have that I needed? What specific preparation was missing? One specific answer to one specific question is worth more than 100 general feelings about what went wrong. Extract the specific. It is where the growth lives. The third stage is integration. The extracted lesson does not automatically change behavior. This is one of the most frustrating realities of human learning. You can understand something completely, know exactly what needs to change, articulate it perfectly, and still revert to the old pattern in the next attempt because the understanding has not been integrated deeply enough to change the automatic behavior. Integration is the process of moving the lesson from intellectual understanding to behavioral change, from knowing something to doing something different because you know it. And this process requires repetition and deliberate practice and the specific, intentional application of the lesson in conditions that are similar to the ones in which the failure occurred. This is why simply reflecting on a failure is not enough to prevent the same failure from recurring. The reflection produces understanding. The integration produces change. And the integration requires the deliberate practice of the new behavior in real conditions where the old behavior would otherwise emerge. If the failure taught you that your preparation was insufficient, the integration is not just deciding to prepare more next time. It is building the specific preparation practice into the daily routine before the next attempt arrives. It is changing the behavior now in the current conditions so that the behavior is already different when the next relevant situation occurs. Integration is where the lesson becomes part of you rather than something you know about yourself. And it is the stage that most people skip, which is why the same failures recur across different contexts with the same underlying pattern. The fourth stage is application. The integrated lesson must be applied in the next relevant attempt in the conditions that are similar enough to the ones in which the failure occurred that the lesson is genuinely being tested. Not in a different domain where the lesson is not relevant, in the specific area where the failure happened and where the growth that the failure made possible is now being demonstrated. Application is the proof. It is the stage where the failure to lesson conversion is completed, where the understanding becomes evidence, where the growth that the failure produced is demonstrated in real conditions with real stakes. And the application is often uncomfortable because the conditions that produced the first failure are similar to the conditions that will produce the test of the lesson. The same domain, the same general type of challenge, the same vulnerability to the same kind of outcome. And the memory of the first failure is present in the attempt at the application. This is where courage is required, the specific courage of returning to the arena where you failed before, of attempting the thing again with the lesson integrated, of demonstrating through the behavior itself that the failure was not a verdict but a teacher. Apply the lesson in the real conditions with the real stakes. That is the completion of the process. That is where the failure finally and fully becomes what it was always meant to be. Not the end of something, the education that made the next thing better. Now I want to talk about the different types of failures and the different lessons each type is specifically designed to teach. Because not all failures are the same, and matching the type of failure to the type of lesson it contains makes the extraction process more efficient and more useful. The first type is the preparation failure, the failure that occurred because the foundation was not solid enough, the knowledge was insufficient, the skill was underdeveloped, the planning was incomplete, the research was inadequate. The preparation failure is not a failure of effort in the moment, it is a failure of the investment that precedes the moment. The lesson of the preparation failure is always the same in its essential form. The work that needs to happen before the attempt is not optional. It cannot be skipped or compressed without consequence. The shortcut that seemed to save time before the attempt created the failure that cost far more time after it. The preparation failure teaches the primacy of foundation,
the non-negotiability of doing the work that precedes the work. And the person who learns this lesson does not just prepare better for the next attempt. They develop a general orientation toward preparation, toward the investment of time and energy before the visible action begins, that makes every subsequent attempt more solid than the previous one. The second type is the execution failure. The preparation was adequate, the knowledge was present, the plan was reasonable, and something went wrong in the doing of it, not in the conception, but in the implementation. The execution failure teaches what happens inside it. The preparation failure teaches what precedes action. The execution failure teaches what happens inside it. The execution failure is often a failure of attention, of focus, of the specific discipline required to do the thing correctly rather than approximately correctly, when the conditions become difficult, or the pressure increases, or the fatigue sets in. It is the gap between knowing how to do something and doing it well under actual conditions rather than ideal ones. The lesson of the execution failure is about the specific conditions of real performance, about what happens to the quality of the execution when the conditions are not favorable, about the specific vulnerabilities, the attention failures, the pressure responses, the fatigue-driven shortcuts that the execution under real conditions exposed. This lesson is not learned in preparation, it is only learned in execution. Only the real conditions reveal what the simulated conditions do not, and the person who learns from their execution failures develops a quality of performance under pressure that people who have never been tested under real conditions simply do not have. The third type is the timing failure. The thing was right, the preparation was adequate, the execution was competent, the timing was wrong, the market was not ready, the relationship was not in the right place, the opportunity that seemed present was actually premature, the moment that looked like the right one was not.
The timing failure is perhaps the most difficult to extract a lesson from because it feels like the least controllable type. And there is truth in that. Timing has an external dimension that is genuinely not fully within anyone's control. But timing also has an internal dimension that is. The ability to read conditions, to assess readiness, not just your own, but the readiness of the environment, the relationship, the market, the opportunity. To distinguish between the moment that is genuinely right and the moment that feels right because the desire to begin has been suppressed long enough. The lesson of the timing failure is about the development of judgment, not the elimination of timing risk. That is not possible. The improvement of the ability to read conditions with accuracy, to distinguish enthusiasm from readiness, to wait when waiting is the right action, and to move when moving is, to develop the specific wisdom of knowing when. The fourth type is the approach failure. The goal was right, the effort was real, the timing was reasonable, the approach was wrong, the strategy was flawed, the method was incorrect for the specific challenge. The path chosen did not lead where it appeared to lead. The approach failure is one of the most valuable types because it teaches directly about strategy, about the relationship between methods and results, about why the same goal can be achieved by one path and missed by another, about the importance of testing and adjusting the approach, rather than doubling down on a method that is not working simply because more effort has been invested in it. The lesson of the approach failure is always a lesson about strategic thinking, about the willingness to change the how even when the what remains the same, about the intellectual flexibility to recognize when the problem is not insufficient effort in the current direction, but wrong direction entirely, and about the courage to change course when the evidence demands it, rather than continuing because the sunk cost of the wrong path makes changing feel like abandoning. Now, let me talk about the growth that turning failures into lessons produces. Not just the improvement in the specific domain of the failure, the broader, deeper, more lasting growth that the practice of learning from failure builds in the person who maintains it consistently. The first growth is the growth of intellectual humility, the honest acknowledgement of what you do not yet know and what you are not yet capable of. Most people resist this humility because it feels like weakness. It is the opposite. It is the foundation of all genuine learning. The person who believes they know enough does not ask the questions that would teach them what they are missing. The person who admits they do not know something goes looking for the answer. And in most domains of human endeavor, the person who is still genuinely curious about what they do not know outperforms the person who has stopped questioning at every level. Failure teaches humility that success never does, because success confirms the existing approach. Failure reveals its limits, and the revealed limit is always the doorway to the next level of development. The second growth is the growth of strategic thinking, the ability to analyze situations, identify what is working and what is not, adjust the approach based on evidence, and improve the decision-making process over time. Every failure that is genuinely examined and genuinely learned from is a lesson in strategic thinking, in the relationship between actions and outcomes, in the specific ways that reality differs from expectation, and what those differences reveal about what needs to change. The person who has turned 10 significant failures into 10 extracted, integrated, applied lessons has a quality of strategic thinking that people who have never failed or who have failed without learning simply do not possess, not because they are more intelligent, because they have been educated by reality in ways that protect them from the specific mistakes that educated the failures. The third growth is the growth of emotional resilience. Not the absence of difficulty or the elimination of the pain of failure, the specific capacity to be in the pain of failure and to continue functioning, to be disappointed without being destroyed, to be wrong without collapsing the self-concept, to face the evidence of insufficient capability without concluding that the insufficiency is permanent. This resilience is built through the experience of surviving failures and learning from them. Every failure that is survived and learned from adds evidence to the case that failure is not fatal, that the self can withstand the experience of being wrong and still be intact on the other side, that the path continues past the failure for the person who keeps walking. Now, I want to talk about what I consider the most important and the most underappreciated growth that turning failures into lessons produces. The growth that makes all the other growth possible, and that is the ultimate reason the practice matters more than any of the specific lessons it teaches. The growth of the learning identity. Most people have a fixed relationship with their own capabilities. They believe at some level that what they are capable of now is approximately what they will always be capable of, that their intelligence is set, their talent is determined, their potential is largely fixed by the combination of nature and early environment that produce their current abilities. This fixed belief, even when it is not consciously held, even when it lives below the surface of explicit thought, shapes everything. It makes failure feel more threatening because failure seems to confirm the fixed limits. It makes learning feel less urgent because improvement seems less possible. It makes risk feel more costly because the downside is permanent and the upside is limited. The practice of turning failures into lessons builds a different belief, not through affirmations or positive thinking or the mere decision to believe something different, but through evidence, the specific, accumulated, repeated evidence that you are capable of learning, that when something goes wrong, you are able to understand why and do something different, that the capability you have today is not the capability you will have after you have learned from what today produces.
That evidence builds an identity, the identity of a learner, a grower, someone whose current capability is genuinely just the current version, subject to change, subject to development, subject to the specific transformations that genuine learning from genuine failure produces. And that identity, once it is genuinely established through the evidence of repeated failure to lesson conversions, changes everything about how you approach challenges and opportunities and the uncertain territory that all meaningful growth requires you to enter. You are not afraid of the territory you are confident you can learn your way through. And the person with a genuine learning identity is confident of exactly that. Not that they will not fail, that they will learn from what they fail at, and that the learning will carry them somewhere that the not failing never could. Build that identity, one extracted lesson at a time, one integrated change at a time, one applied improvement at a time, until the pattern of failing and learning and growing is so established that it is simply who you are and how you operate in the world. Let me talk about the practical daily behaviors that support the failure to lesson practice, because the practice requires more than understanding. It requires the specific, daily behaviors that keep the learning active rather than letting it be crowded out by the pace of a life that does not automatically create space for reflection and extraction and integration. The first behavior is the regular review, the deliberate, scheduled, not when I feel like it practice of looking back at what happened recently and asking the extraction questions. What went wrong this week? And what specifically does it tell me? What decision produced a result I did not intend, and what does that reveal about the decision or the assumptions behind it? What pattern am I noticing across the recent failures that suggests something I need to change rather than just an isolated mistake? This review does not need to be long, 15 minutes at the end of the week. Honest questions, specific answers, written down where they can be returned to and built upon rather than evaporating in the busy immediacy of the next week. The second behavior is the failure journal. Not a record of your failures as documentation of inadequacy, a record of them as a library of lessons. The specific extraction from each significant failure, what happened, what it revealed, what the lesson is, and what behavioral change is required to integrate it. The practice of writing the lesson down transforms it from a thought into a commitment, from an idea about what needs to change into an explicit statement of what you are going to do differently. And the failure journal, reviewed periodically, reveals the patterns that individual reviews miss, the recurring themes, the lessons that keep appearing in different forms because the underlying behavior that produces them has not been genuinely changed. The specific areas of persistent vulnerability that require deeper work than a single lesson can provide. The third behavior is the pre-mortem. Before a significant attempt, spend time imagining its failure. Not to generate pessimism or undermine confidence, but to preemptively extract the lessons that the failure would teach. If this attempt fails, what is the most likely reason? What is the assumption that is most likely to be wrong? What is the preparation that is most likely to be insufficient? What is the execution challenge that is most likely to emerge? The pre-mortem builds the preparation that failure would otherwise teach. It lets you extract the lesson before it costs you the failure. Not all failures can be preempted this way. Many of the most valuable lessons can only be learned by doing, but some of them can. And the regular practice of asking what could go wrong and how to prevent it is one of the most powerful applications of the failure to lesson learning in a domain that has not yet been entered.